In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus talks about the great tribulation that comes upon the earth. When is it? What's going to happen? Who's going to go through it? Many believers, when they ask these questions, overlook three key facts about the Great Tribulation. And if you miss them, you're bound to misunderstand what the Great Tribulation even is. So let's look at what Scripture actually says in Matthew chapter 24 and parallel it with the rest of the Gospels. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 21, we have what's commonly referred to as the Great Tribulation. And this is all about what Jesus is describing as happening in the future. But there are 5 key essential facts about the Great Tribulation right here that a lot of people don't even know about. So I'm going to show you these things to help you understand what indeed is this, which is there will be such great tribulation. And you can read Matthew chapter 24 to see what this great tribulation is about. He says there will be such great tribulation, or be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days, which seem to be the days referring to the Great Tribulation, would be cut short. So these days, and they say, Jesus says it's unlike what has ever been and ever will be. Is that hyperbolic language, or does he literally mean that? Well, let me take you to Mark's Gospel. This is very important to understand as we navigate these texts. The Gospels all work together to present us a clear picture of who Jesus is, what he's done, and what he's promised. So Mark's account of this very speech from Jesus gives us some details that Matthew actually doesn't. And it's very important that you see this first thing about the Great Tribulation, okay? Because in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is answering the disciples' question about when these things will be, and the Great Tribulation fits into that. In Mark chapter 13, I want you to see this. This is as he came out of the temple, right? This is Jesus. One of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones, what wonderful buildings." So what's the focus here? The wonderful buildings, the stones, the temple. What does Jesus say about it? Well, Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings?" Which I'm going to highlight in this salmon color because salmon is cool. You see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now watch what Mark tells us happens when the disciples hear this. Watch. It says, "And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple," which here we have the temple in view again. Dang it, I used the wrong color. It is what it is. Here we have Peter, we have James, and we have John, and we have Andrew asking him what? Privately. Privately. "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" So hold on to that. Who approaches Jesus? Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And they're asking him what? Privately. That's what Mark's gospel tells us. So when we go back to Matthew chapter 24, and you see this great tribulation Jesus refers to, Matthew actually tells us what it is that Jesus is answering. Okay? It's right here. Sorry. Same thing. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, and part of this answer is what we refer to as this great tribulation. In other words, the first thing to know is this: Peter, James, and John, and Andrew are privately coming to Jesus about this matter. So when we talk about the Great Tribulation, this is Jesus' answer to a private question that is brought up by 4 of his disciples, his closest friends. That's the first thing to know. Frame this up as a private answer to a private question, not some public spectacle of some, common knowledge that everyone's aware of. This is a private answer to a private question. Why is that important? Well, because when you start this speech from Jesus, okay, which is him foretelling the destruction of the temple and the sign of the end of the age, what Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us is that the Great Tribulation is part of his answer to this question. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him what? The buildings of the temple. They got the right color this time. But he answered them, "You see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." What is Jesus describing? Just like Mark accounted for, that Jesus is talking about the destruction of the actual building, the temple, the central focus of the Israelite nation in Jerusalem, right? As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Okay, these are three specific things they're asking about. When will these things be? Number one, the temple. Number two, what will be the sign of your coming? That's the second thing they ask about. And these are not necessarily all the same question. Number three, what is the sign of the end of the age? This word "and" tells us that there's a possibility what they describe here, the end of the age, is going to be somewhat in their minds distinguished from the sign of his coming. Okay, we can talk about that later, but for now know this. The second thing to know about the Great Tribulation is it is part of Jesus' answer to when will the temple be destroyed? When will that be destroyed? The Great Tribulation fits into that as part of his answer. Mark tells us this. Luke tells us this in Luke chapter 21. When Luke is accounting this very speech from Jesus to his disciples. If you go to Luke 21, Jesus says this, same thing. While some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, all these things that you see, right? The days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And they asked him, when will these things be? So the things they're talking about, is the main event is the destruction of the temple. In other words, we need to see the Great Tribulation as relating to and connecting to the destruction of the temple at that point in human history and in the history of the Israelite nation. That is very important to understand. Okay? When we go back to Matthew's gospel, I'm going to do my best to not hop around as much. Okay, but this is just the nature of this study. When you go back to Matthew 24 and the way that Jesus describes this great tribulation that's coming upon the earth that everyone has their, thoughts about and speculations, if you notice in verse 34 of this speech Jesus gives involving the great tribulation, do you know what he says? He says, "Truly I say to you," and I know we're jumping around. We could easily go through chapter 24 altogether at some point in a future video. But know this, verse 34 seems to be Jesus ending his discussion on the destruction of the temple, okay, which includes the Great Tribulation. "Truly I say to you, this generation," well, what generation? Consistent with Matthew's gospel, anytime the generation is referred to, it refers to the people of Israel that are there on the earth during the days of Jesus. In other words, the generation of Israelites that are alive during the lifetime of Jesus that will end up crucifying him and yell out, "Crucify him," and put him on the cross and hand him to the Romans. This generation is consistently in Matthew's gospel referring to the Israelites who were there. He says this generation will not pass away, right? If you take a generation to mean 70, 80 years, however you qualify that, this generation in Jesus' time, he says they will not pass away until. In other words, there's a time marker on this. When will this generation pass away or die? And this is not figurative or metaphorical or symbolic. This generation will literally die and fade away, and a new generation will take its place. When will that happen? Well, this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. What things? Let's highlight that in blue. What things is he describing as taking place? Well, up to verse 34, starting in verse 3, all the way to verse 34, they say, when will these things be? The destruction of the temple, which in their mind involves a sign of his coming and the end of the age. And as we see in Matthew's gospel and throughout the gospels, the disciples don't really have a correct chronology or understanding of what the future of Israel necessarily looks like. They understand parts of it, okay? But the third fact about the Great Tribulation is that actually this generation won't pass away until that Great Tribulation happens, which is the people of Israel alive during the lifetime of Jesus. In other words, this seems to mark the end of what Jesus has been describing up to this point. This generation will pass away, which marks the end of these things that have taken place. The Great Tribulation, per the words of Jesus, read the other accounts of this of this speech from Jesus. The Great Tribulation comes before the people of that generation pass away. Now, I know you're going to have lots of questions about the sun and moon turning dark and the stars falling from heaven, and that didn't happen, and we'll get into that in the future, okay? But for now, these are just factual things. There's no way to get around the fact that he says this generation that he's looking at, speaking to, describing all throughout Matthew's gospel, they won't die and fade away until what he's just described takes place, which involves the what? The Great Tribulation, okay? Luke actually tells us what the Great Tribulation is. So here's the fourth fact about the Great Tribulation, okay? So let's just do this. I'm going to parallel these passages so you understand that we are talking about the same exact thing throughout Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are different accounts of the same exact speech. For instance, let me read to you Matthew 24, okay? And I'll show you with Luke's gospel how he parallels this. Matthew 24, Jesus, sitting on the Mount of Olives, disciples come to him. They ask the question. Jesus answers, "Well, see that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they'll lead many astray. And you'll actually hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed." So let's just highlight a few aspects of what will accompany what they refer to as these things, the destruction of the temple. Well, there seems to be prevalent deception, right? Seems to be rumors of wars and actual wars taking place, right? He says, "See that you're not alarmed, for this must take place. The end is not yet." So even when those things happen, they're not necessarily a sign of the end. It's actually just what's coming before the end. "For nation will rise against nation." Let's just highlight that. "Kingdom will rise against kingdom." There will actually be famines and earthquakes. Let's just mark these things. So by the time we get to Luke's gospel, you can see that we're talking about the same event in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. In other words, Jesus says the same thing. The end is not yet. "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation." So we have persecution. We have, the apostles being delivered up to trouble, death. They'll put you to death. "You will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Then many will fall away, and they'll betray one another and hate one another." And what else? Well, many false prophets will arise. We have deception, lead many astray. "And because lawlessness will be increased," so we have sin increasing, "we have the love of many growing cold," right? "But the one who endures to the end will be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come." Let's go to Luke's gospel to see how what Jesus says and what Luke accounts for in this exact speech, because different gospel authors will highlight certain details that others might leave out, not to show that they're inconsistent, but they're, Matthew organizes his content topically. Luke organizes his as an account for Theophilus, as he's primarily writing to Gentiles, those who aren't super familiar with the Jewish history. So Luke 21, let me show you let's start in verse 5. This same exact, remember all the things that we highlighted, okay? We'll highlight in yellow again. Well, some were speaking of the temple, right? They come to say to him, "Hey, when will these things be?" What's Jesus' answer? He said, "See that you're not led astray," just like we saw in Matthew 24, deception. "Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Don't go after them. When you hear of wars, tumults, don't be terrified," right? These things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. In other words, exactly what we see in Matthew 24. Exact same characteristics. "Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation." There we see that again. "Kingdom against kingdom." What else do we see? We see earthquakes, right? We see famines. We see pestilence. There will be terrors, great signs in the heavens, okay? But before all this, guess what? They will lay their hands on you. So before all of this that he's describing, they'll lay their hands on you. Persecution seems to be an indication of where we're at chronologically in comparison to the Great Tribulation. Delivering you up, to the synagogues and the prisons. "And you'll be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake," just like Matthew 24. "This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it therefore in your minds not to meditate beforehand how to answer. For I'll give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict." We see that with Stephen and Peter and James and John. "You'll be delivered up," right? Here's the persecution aspect, "by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put to death. You'll be hated." There it is again. by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you'll gain your lives. In other words, he who endures to the end will be saved. Okay, so obviously we're talking about the same exact speech Jesus gives in Matthew and Luke's gospel. Okay, so let's keep reading. Let's keep reading. Chronologically, in the speech of Jesus, we just ended, he says, essentially, by your endurance, you'll gain your lives, or he who endures to the end will be saved. Now, what does he say next? He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, okay? You're going to see in Matthew's gospel, at this point in Jesus' speech, Jesus refers to the abomination of desolation, which Matthew's audience, primarily Jewish people, and Hebrews would be very familiar with that concept in Daniel's prophecy. Then know that its desolation has come near. But Luke, writing to a primarily Gentile audience, Theophilus, he has to describe what's going to happen. He can't use the shorthand of abomination of desolation. He has to say, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For, these are the days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. These days seem to be wrathful, vengeance, God bringing vengeance and wrath. Alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, there will be great distress upon the earth. What Jesus describes in Matthew 24 as what? Great tribulation on the earth, and wrath against this people. Let's highlight those aspects. This is vengeance and wrath. Against what? This people. Who's he talking about? This generation will not pass away. This people being the rebellious, unbelieving, disobedient Jewish people who crucified the Messiah. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, which is a profaning thing, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So notice what Luke emphasizes, that the tribulation is wrath, vengeance, distress upon the earth, which seems to refer to the land of Israel, because it's referring to what? Jerusalem being trampled. It refers to what? Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. So when we go back to Matthew's gospel, notice, we're going to start at the same point in Jesus' speech chronologically. Now read Matthew 24 with me at the same point. Just where we left off in Luke's gospel, where it talked about enduring to the end will be saved, he who endures, right? Then he's going to talk about the abomination of desolation, the exact same point in his speech we just looked at in Luke's gospel. When you see the abomination of desolation, which his Jewish audience would be familiar with because it's spoken by the prophet Daniel. They're familiar with Daniel's writings. Standing in the holy place. What's the holy place? What's the holy place? Well, he seems to be referring to the temple. That's what he's addressing when these things will be. The destruction of the holy place being the temple. Let the reader understand. Daniel talked about this in his prophecy. And in Luke's gospel, we saw that Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. The temple is trampled down. Let those who are in Judea, so here we have this, the part of Israel where the temple and Jerusalem are located. In that region, he's telling people to flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. Let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. We're talking about a specific region. And alas, for women, just like we saw in Luke 21, addressing women who are pregnant, alas for them and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then, watch, there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days, what days is he talking about? Well, from his vantage point, it's in the future. It refers to Jerusalem. It refers to a holy place being desolate and an abomination standing in that place, which seems to refer to Gentile armies surrounding Jerusalem, trampling the temple. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short, and you can keep reading on and on. But the point is, those days are referenced a lot. The days of what? Tribulation, the great tribulation. Now, you can run to Revelation and correspond a lot to what Jesus says in Matthew 24. But so far, there are 4 facts right? This is to Peter, James, John, and Andrew privately. This is a private question, a private answer. The second thing, this is the answer to when will these things happen? In other words, when will those days be when the temple is destroyed? Well, Jerusalem's going to be surrounded. Pagan Gentiles will trample it underfoot, and it'll be the abomination of desolation spoken of in Daniel. Okay. The third thing is he says in verse 34, these things will happen before the generation of Jesus' day passes away. The fourth thing we saw is that the Great Tribulation actually involves Jerusalem being surrounded by armies and the temple being destroyed, which is consistent with Jesus' answer to the question. The last thing I want to show you is right here. Now, this will take a great deal of time to prove, but this will be a future video for sure. There's internal contextual evidence to believe that verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. This event, verse 35, which I'm going to circle, seems to be, and again, there's internal contextual evidence here and in Mark and Luke's gospel to believe that verse 35 is actually describing a different event than verse 1 through 34, or what Jesus has been describing up to this point in verse 34. That's why verse 34 seems to be an end cap and be an end marker to tell us when these things will end. Well, the generation of Jesus' day will pass away, and these things will have taken place. And Jesus seems to transition in verse 35 and on to talk about a different event in human history. Now, we can talk about this in future videos, and I understand you want proof now. This is a long video as it is. But those are the 5 facts. The last one maybe not being as concrete as you might want it to be, but I can spend some time proving that in future videos. But these are the 5 key essential facts we need to understand about the Great Tribulation that is described in Matthew's Gospel, Mark's, and Luke's, and what I also believe is being described in the book of Revelation. Okay, I know these are quite the wild claims, but I don't believe there's any reason so far to disagree with what I've brought forward. Hey, if you want to learn how to read the Bible and understand Scripture and go deep into the Bible, maybe you're bored, frustrated, overwhelmed, you don't know where to start, why don't you check out our completely free online 40-day Bible study program linked in the description below. It's online and self-paced. Again, great situation for you. And if you don't want to click the link, just go to abovereproachministry.com and check out all the free courses we have to offer. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and do that and hit the bell so you can be notified of any future videos that come out. And check out abovereproachministry.com. We have completely free Bible study courses, a 40-day program, a 27-day, and 11-day program, all kinds of free resources. You can get a copy of my book. You can join our online church. You can get some merch. We have a bunch of stuff at abovereproachministry.com, and it's also linked in the description below. Go check that out, and thanks for watching.